The phone rang at exactly 9:15 on a Tuesday morning, interrupting my morning coffee ritual. I almost ignored it when I saw my mother's name flashing on the screen. Patricia hadn't called me in over 8 months, not since last Christmas, when she made her usual polite small talk for exactly 12 minutes before finding an excuse to hang up. But something made me answer that call, and I wish I could take it back. Her voice was sharp, businesslike, completely devoid of the warmth most people associate with maternal conversations. She didn't ask how I was doing, didn't inquire about my job or my life. Instead, she launched straight into her demand, with the same tone she might use to order groceries. My name is Alonzo, and I'm 32 years old now, working as a software engineer here in Austin, Texas. Life has been good to me these past few years, but it wasn't always this way. 5 years ago, when I was 27, I received news that shattered my world completely. Stage 2 lymphoma. The doctor's words echoed in that sterile examination room as I sat alone trying to process what he was telling me about treatment options, survival rates, and the brutal road ahead. The first people I called were my parents, Patricia, and Robert. They lived just 40 minutes away in Cedar Park, comfortable in their suburban home where they'd raised my brother Marcus and me. I expected support, maybe even a hug, definitely some kind of emotional comfort during the scariest moment of my life. What I got instead was a lecture about personal responsibility and financial limitations. Patricia's voice had been cold that day too, explaining how they simply couldn't afford to help with my medical expenses or care. She mentioned Marcus's gambling debts, their own retirement concerns, and the burden of their mortgage payments. Robert had chimed in from the background, suggesting I look into state assistance programs or charity care. They made it sound like my cancer was an inconvenient expense I was trying to pass off to them. The next 6 months became a nightmare I wouldn't wish on anyone. Chemotherapy sessions left me weak and nauseated, unable to work my usual hours. I lost my apartment when I couldn't make rent, ended up crashing on my friend Kevin's couch for weeks. My savings evaporated between co-pays, medications, and basic survival expenses. Some days I was too sick to eat, other days I couldn't afford food anyway. Marcus never visited me once during treatment. Not in the hospital, not at Kevin's place, nowhere. He was too busy with whatever scheme he was running that week, always chasing easy money and avoiding responsibility. My parents would give me updates about his latest adventures when I called them, but they never asked about my blood counts or how the radiation was affecting me. The charitable organizations kept me alive. Local churches brought meals. The cancer support group helped with transportation to appointments, and strangers donated money through online fundraisers my friends organized. Complete strangers showed me more compassion during those dark months than my own family ever did. But I survived. I beat the cancer, rebuilt my credit, found a better job, and moved into a nice apartment near downtown Austin. I even started dating Sarah, a wonderful woman who worked as a family law paralegal at a firm downtown. Life had become stable, peaceful, and genuinely happy for the first time in years. Then Marcus died in a car accident 3 weeks ago, and suddenly my parents remembered I existed. Patricia's explanation came in rapid-fire sentences, as if she was reading from a script. Marcus had been driving drunk, hit a tree on Highway 35, died instantly. His 3 children were now orphans since their mother had died from an overdose 2 years prior. Emma was 12 and the twins, Jake and Lucy, were 8 years old. The children needed a guardian, and my parents had decided I was the obvious choice. The irony was so thick I could taste it. These same people who claimed poverty when I was dying from cancer suddenly expected me to uproot my entire life to raise 3 children I barely knew. They spoke about family duty and moral obligation as if those concepts had meant anything to them when I was vomiting from chemotherapy and sleeping on floors. But the real shock came when Patricia mentioned they'd already spoken with the social worker handling the case. They'd told Janet Morrison that I was eager to take custody and had been preparing for weeks to welcome the children into my home. They'd painted me as the loving, responsible uncle who couldn't wait to provide a stable environment for his deceased brother's offspring. That's when I realized this wasn't a request. This was a manipulation carefully orchestrated to put me in an impossible position. They'd already committed me to a decision I'd never made, created expectations I'd never agreed to meet, and cornered me into a situation where refusing would make me look heartless and selfish. The conversation ended with Patricia informing me that Janet would be bringing the children to my apartment in exactly 2 hours. She hung up before I could protest, leaving me staring at my phone in complete disbelief. The same parents who'd abandoned me during my darkest hour were now demanding I sacrifice my rebuilt life for the sake of family obligations they'd never honored themselves. I spent the next 2 hours pacing my apartment like a caged animal, trying to figure out how to handle the impossible situation my parents had created. Sarah arrived just as I finished my third cup of coffee, sensing something was wrong the moment she saw my expression. When I explained what had happened, her face cycled through confusion, anger, and determination in rapid succession. At exactly 11:15, three soft knocks echoed through my apartment. I opened the door to find Janet Morrison, a tired-looking woman in her 40s carrying a worn briefcase and wearing the expression of someone who'd seen too much heartbreak in her career. Behind her stood three children who looked like they hadn't slept in weeks. Emma, the 12-year-old, had Marcus's dark hair but none of his reckless energy. She held the hands of her younger siblings protectively, her eyes scanning my apartment as if evaluating whether this new place might be safe. Jake and Lucy, the 8-year-old twins, clung to their sister with the desperate grip of children who'd learned that adults couldn't be trusted to stay. Their clothes were clean but ill-fitting, obviously donated items from various sources. Jake's sneakers had holes near the toes, and Lucy's jacket was 3 sizes too large. Emma carried a garbage bag that apparently contained all their worldly possessions, and the weight of responsibility in her young eyes made my chest tight with emotion. Janet's voice was professional, but kind as she explained the custody arrangements my parents had supposedly finalized. According to her files, I had requested emergency guardianship and demonstrated financial stability and emotional readiness to provide for the children's needs. She handed me a folder containing medical records, school information, and legal documents that painted me as an enthusiastic caregiver. That's when my parents arrived, Patricia, clutching a manila envelope filled with pre-signed custody papers. Robert trailing behind her with the uncomfortable expression of someone who knew they were doing something questionable but lacked the backbone to object. They greeted the children with forced enthusiasm, promising them that Uncle Alonzo would provide everything they needed. Patricia's performance was masterful. She spoke about my successful career, my spacious apartment, and my genuine love for the children with conviction that almost made me believe I'd actually volunteered for this responsibility. She mentioned my recovery from cancer as evidence of my strength and resilience, twisting my survival story into proof that I could handle any challenge. The children listened with the polite attention of kids who'd been passed around enough to recognize adult conversations that would determine their fate. Emma's grip on her siblings tightened whenever someone mentioned their future, and I caught her studying my face as if trying to determine whether I might be another disappointment waiting to happen. Sarah watched this manipulation unfold with the sharp eyes of someone who understood legal maneuvering. She asked pointed questions about the timeline, the children's current living situation, and the process that had led to this moment. Her inquiries made Janet shift uncomfortably, and my parents exchanged nervous glances. That's when the first crack in their story appeared. Janet mentioned almost casually that the children had been in temporary foster care for 3 weeks while arrangements were finalized. This directly contradicted my parents' claim that they'd been caring for the children since Marcus's death and had only now reached out to me. Emma spoke up quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She explained that they'd been staying with a nice foster family named the Johnsons, who had given them clean clothes and regular meals. Before that, they'd spent one night with their grandparents who had explained they were too old and poor to provide proper care for 3 children. The contradiction hung in the air like smoke impossible to ignore. My parents had lied about their involvement, their timeline, and their motivations. They'd use the children as pawns in whatever game they were playing, creating false narratives to manipulate both the social services system and me. But looking at those three exhausted, hopeful faces, I realized the truth of their manipulation mattered less than the reality of these children's needs. Emma, Jake, and Lucy had been abandoned by everyone who should have protected them. They'd lost their father to addiction, and their mother to overdose, been shuffled through temporary arrangements, and were now looking at me as their potential salvation. Janet pulled me aside while my parents distracted the children with promises of ice cream and new toys. She explained that my parents had been surprisingly insistent about avoiding any financial responsibility for the children's care. They'd emphasized my income and stability while highlighting their own limitations, painting themselves as loving but practical grandparents who recognized their nephew's superior ability to provide. The manipulation was becoming clearer with each revelation. My parents hadn't reached out because they loved these children or felt responsible for their welfare. They'd orchestrated this entire scenario to transfer an unwanted burden to someone they'd already proven they were willing to abandon during crisis. As I watched Emma help her younger siblings explore my apartment, pointing out the comfortable furniture and promising them they'd be safe here, I made a decision that surprised even me. I agreed to take temporary custody, but not because my parents had manipulated me into it. I agreed because these children deserved better than the adults who'd failed them so far, and maybe I could provide the stability they desperately needed. But I also decided to start digging into the real reasons my parents were so eager to avoid responsibility for their own grandchildren. Something about their story didn't add up, and my experience with their lies during my cancer battle had taught me to question everything they claimed about their financial limitations and family obligations. The children moved in that afternoon, transforming my quiet apartment into something resembling an actual home. Emma helped her siblings settle into the spare bedroom. Sarah and I quickly converted with blankets and pillows. Jake and Lucy seemed overwhelmed by having their own space and toys that weren't shared with other foster children. But as I tucked them in that first night listening to their whispered conversations about whether this placement might be permanent, I wondered what other lies my parents had told and what other motivations they were hiding behind their performance of concerned grandparents who simply couldn't manage the responsibility themselves. The next morning brought a revelation that changed everything I thought I knew about my parents' financial situation. While the children ate breakfast and Sarah helped them prepare for their first day at local schools, I made a phone call that would expose the depth of my parents' deception. Thomas Bradley, my lawyer friend from college, had always been straight with me about legal matters. When I explained the custody situation and my suspicions about my parents' true motivations, he recommended a private investigator named Diana Walsh, who specialized in financial background checks. Diana's voice was crisp and professional as she explained how quickly she could uncover assets, expenditures, and financial patterns. Within 24 hours, Diana had compiled a report that made my blood boil. My parents weren't just financially comfortable, they were borderline wealthy. They owned 2 rental properties in Round Rock that generated substantial monthly income, had accumulated over $400,000 in retirement savings, and had recently purchased a $40,000 recreational vehicle for their planned cross-country retirement tours. The timing of their RV purchase was particularly infuriating. They'd bought it just 6 months after my cancer diagnosis, while I was still recovering from treatment and struggling to rebuild my financial stability. The down payment alone could have covered all my medical expenses and prevented the apartment loss that had left me homeless during chemotherapy. But the most damning evidence came from their credit card statements, which Diana had legally obtained through public records of their recent RV financing. During the exact period when they'd claimed poverty and inability to help with my medical crisis, they'd spent $30,000 renovating their kitchen. Granite countertops, custom cabinets, and professional-grade appliances had been more important than their son's survival. Meanwhile, the children were revealing their own heartbreaking truths about life with Marcus and their grandparents' minimal involvement. Emma, wise beyond her 12 years, described her father's frequent disappearances and drug-fueled binges that left them alone for days. She'd learned to change diapers, heat up canned food, and get her siblings ready for school when Marcus was too high or absent to function. Jake and Lucy shared stories about visiting their grandparents' house, where they were expected to sit quietly and not touch anything valuable. Patricia had complained about the cost of feeding them during visits, and Robert had frequently mentioned how expensive children were to maintain. The kids had learned to ask for smaller portions and decline offers of snacks to avoid being burdens. The children's resilience amazed me, but their stories also revealed years of emotional neglect that extended far beyond Marcus's addiction problems. My parents had been aware of the deteriorating situation, but had chosen to minimize their involvement rather than provide meaningful support. They'd treated their grandchildren like expensive inconveniences rather than family members deserving protection and care. Sarah's expertise as a family law paralegal proved invaluable as she helped me understand the legal implications of what we were discovering. She explained how the custody arrangements my parents had orchestrated were unusual in their speed and specificity. Normally, such placements involved extensive background checks, home visits, and gradual transition periods designed to ensure children's well-being. The fact that my parents had been able to arrange immediate placement suggested they'd provided compelling reasons why traditional guardianship options wouldn't work. Sarah suspected they'd painted themselves as willing but unable guardians, while positioning me as the eager alternative, streamlining a process that should have taken weeks into a matter of days. Emma's academic records revealed another disturbing pattern. Her grades had declined significantly over the past 2 years, coinciding with her mother's death and increased responsibility for her younger siblings. Teachers had noted her frequent tardiness, incomplete homework, and obvious exhaustion in class. Several educators had attempted to contact Marcus about Emma's situation, but their calls had gone unanswered. The school counselor, Mrs. Henderson, had actually filed reports with social services about potential neglect in the household. However, Marcus had managed to charm his way through the investigations, promising improvements that never materialized. Emma had learned to cover for her father's failures, creating elaborate explanations for missed parent conferences and unpaid school fees. Jake and Lucy's medical records showed missed immunizations, skipped dental appointments, and untreated minor injuries that should have received professional attention. They'd been living in survival mode for so long that basic health care had become a luxury their chaotic household couldn't manage consistently. As I reviewed this mountain of evidence about my family's failures, I began to understand that my parents' manipulation wasn't just about avoiding financial responsibility. They were covering up years of willful neglect, passing their grandchildren to me before anyone could examine too closely how 3 children had been allowed to suffer while their grandparents lived comfortably just 40 minutes away. The children's transformation in just 1 week of stability was remarkable. Emma's shoulders had relaxed, and she'd started smiling when she thought no one was watching. Jake and Lucy had gained weight from regular meals and were sleeping through the night for the first time in months. They'd begun treating my apartment like a real home rather than another temporary stop in their chaotic journey. But my growing attachment to these children was complicated by my anger at the circumstances that had brought them to me. My parents had orchestrated this entire situation to solve their problem while avoiding accountability for their choices. They'd manipulated the system, lied to social services, and used my sense of responsibility against me. That's when Diana called with information that would change the entire dynamic of our situation. She discovered something in my parents' financial records that suggested their motivations for avoiding the children went far deeper than simple inconvenience or expense. There were connections to Marcus's lifestyle that painted a much darker picture of why my parents were so eager to distance themselves from his children. Marcus had been involved in activities that put everyone around him at risk, and my parents had been aware of the danger while choosing to protect themselves rather than their grandchildren. The children weren't just orphans in need of care, they were potential targets in a situation my parents understood but had never bothered to explain. As I put the children to bed that night, listening to their prayers for their dad and mom, and hopes that they could stay with me forever, I realized my parents had trapped me in a situation far more complicated and dangerous than simple custody arrangements. They'd handed me 3 vulnerable children while hiding the threats that might be coming for them, prioritizing their own safety over their grandchildren's welfare and my right to make an informed decision. The manipulation was even deeper than I'd imagined, and the confrontation I was planning would need to address not just their lies about money and care, but their willingness to put innocent children in harm's way to protect themselves from consequences they'd helped create. My parents' true motivations became crystal clear on a Thursday evening that started normally but quickly spiraled into something resembling a nightmare. The children were doing homework at the kitchen table. Sarah was preparing dinner, and I was reviewing Diana's latest findings when the doorbell rang with an urgency that immediately put me on edge. Patricia and Robert stood outside my door with expressions I'd never seen before. Fear, raw, desperate fear that made Patricia's usual composed demeanor crack completely. They pushed past me into the apartment, glancing nervously over their shoulders, as if expecting someone to follow them inside. Robert's hands shook as he explained that Marcus's drug debts were far worse than they'd initially believed. He hadn't just been using drugs, he'd been selling them, and he'd stolen $50,000 from his suppliers before the car accident that killed him. The people Marcus had robbed weren't the type to write off business losses as bad luck. Patricia's voice cracked as she described the phone calls they'd been receiving, threats about what would happen if Marcus's debt wasn't recovered, promises that his children might know where he'd hidden the stolen money, suggestions that grandparents who claimed to love their family should be more cooperative in helping resolve outstanding financial obligations. The drug dealers had been pressuring my parents for weeks, demanding they turn over the children for questioning about Marcus's hiding places. Patricia and Robert had been stalling, claiming the children were in protective custody and couldn't be accessed immediately. They'd bought time by suggesting their nephew was a more suitable guardian who might be willing to cooperate with reasonable requests for information. That's when I understood the real reason for the rushed custody arrangements. My parents hadn't been trying to find the best home for 3 orphaned children. They'd been trying to create distance between themselves and the dangerous people Marcus had cheated, using me as a buffer to protect their own safety, while putting the children directly in harm's way. Emma looked up from her math homework with the expression of someone who'd heard similar conversations before. She confirmed that strange men had visited their house multiple times during Marcus's final months, always asking about money and making their father nervous and angry. After one particularly frightening visit, Marcus had moved them to a cheap motel for several weeks, claiming their house wasn't safe anymore. The twins remembered the men too, describing them as loud and scary people who made their dad cry after they left. Jake mentioned that Marcus had once hidden a bag somewhere special, but he'd been too young to understand its significance or remember the location clearly. Sarah immediately recognized the legal implications of what my parents were revealing. They'd knowingly placed 3 children in potential danger by transferring custody without disclosing relevant safety threats. They'd manipulated social services by withholding information that would have required different placement procedures and protective measures. But before we could fully process the scope of their betrayal, the situation escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. The building's security buzzer rang, followed immediately by aggressive pounding on my apartment door. Through the peephole, I saw 3 men who definitely weren't making social calls. Vincent Rodriguez, the apparent leader, was a compact man with neck tattoos and the predatory confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating others. His companions Luis and Carlos flanked him like bodyguards, their hands positioned suspiciously near jacket pockets that probably contained weapons. They demanded entry with the casual authority of people who weren't accustomed to being refused. Vincent explained that they needed to have a conversation with Marcus's children about some missing property that belonged to them. He suggested that cooperative family members who helped resolve this situation might avoid unnecessary complications in their own lives. Patricia immediately offered to give the children to these men, suggesting they were better equipped to get truthful answers about Marcus's hiding places. She claimed the children would be safer with people who understood the seriousness of the situation rather than with relatives who might accidentally interfere with important business matters. Robert supported his wife's position, emphasizing that he and Patricia were elderly people who couldn't protect anyone if the situation became dangerous. He suggested that Vincent and his associates were reasonable businessmen who simply wanted to recover their stolen property and move on with their lives. The children's terror was palpable. Emma positioned herself protectively in front of her siblings, while Jake and Lucy clung to each other with the desperate grip of kids who'd seen enough violence to recognize real threats. They looked at their grandparents with expressions of betrayal that would haunt me forever, finally understanding that the adults they'd trusted were willing to sacrifice them to save themselves. Officer Bradley Williams, who'd been quietly listening from the hallway after responding to a neighbor's complaint about the disturbance, stepped into the apartment with the measured authority of someone trained to de-escalate dangerous situations. His presence changed the dynamic, immediately forcing everyone to lower their voices and maintain at least a pretense of civility. Vincent attempted to explain their visit as a simple conversation between family members about resolving a deceased relative's debts. He claimed they were trying to help the children understand their father's obligations and find a way to make things right for everyone involved. His tone was reasonable, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. Officer Williams wasn't buying the performance. He'd seen enough drug-related intimidation to recognize the signs, and his questions about the nature of Marcus's debts and the visitor's relationship to the children made Vincent increasingly uncomfortable. The officer suggested that any legitimate business concerns should be addressed through proper legal channels rather than late-night visits to apartments containing minors. That's when Emma found the courage to speak truth that would save all of us. She explained in a voice barely above a whisper that her father had never hidden money around children. Marcus had been too paranoid and drug-addled to trust anyone with his secrets, and he'd spent any extra money on more drugs within days of getting it. She described his behavior during his final months, the constant paranoia and delusions that had made him suspicious of everyone, including his own children. He'd accused them of trying to steal from him, searched their belongings regularly, and moved their living location frequently because he believed people were watching him. Vincent's frustration was obvious as Emma continued her explanation. Marcus had been convinced that his phone was tapped, his house was bugged, and his children were being questioned by enemies trying to locate his stash. He'd kept them isolated and scared specifically because he didn't trust them with any information that might be valuable to his creditors. The final piece of Emma's testimony destroyed any hope Vincent had of extracting useful information from the children. She revealed that Marcus had often told them he'd spent all his money on product he'd already used, and that anyone looking for hidden cash was wasting their time because he'd never been smart enough to save anything for the future. Officer Williams used Emma's statement as an opportunity to suggest that Vincent and his associates had received misleading information about the children's knowledge. He recommended they pursue other avenues for debt recovery while allowing the newly orphaned kids to grieve their father's death in peace. But just as the situation seemed to be de-escalating, Diana called my phone with information that would reveal the true scope of my parents' betrayal and put everyone in the room at risk of arrest. The conversation I'd been dreading was about to become far more complicated than I'd ever imagined possible. Diana's call came at the worst possible moment, but the information she provided changed everything I thought I knew about my parents' involvement in Marcus's dangerous lifestyle. Her voice was tense as she explained that her investigation had uncovered financial records proving Patricia and Robert hadn't just been victims of Marcus's poor choices, they'd been willing participants in his criminal activities. For over 2 years, my parents had been receiving monthly payments of $1,500 from Vincent's organization in exchange for information about Marcus's movements, habits, and potential hiding places. They'd been paid informants helping the drug dealers track their own son's activities while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement. The recordings Diana had obtained through legal channels revealed conversations between my mother and Vincent dating back 18 months. Patricia had provided details about Marcus's work schedule, his children's school activities, and his regular hangout locations. She'd been especially helpful in identifying when Marcus was likely to be carrying large amounts of cash or product. Robert had contributed by monitoring Marcus's social media accounts and reporting any posts that might indicate drug dealing activities or unexpected income. He'd also provided access to family gathering information, allowing the dealers to know when Marcus would be isolated and vulnerable to pressure. The payments had been justified as compensation for family consultation services, but the true nature of their arrangement was obvious. My parents had been willing to help dangerous criminals monitor and ultimately harm their own son in exchange for monthly income that supplemented their comfortable retirement lifestyle. Officer Williams listened to Diana's revelations with the growing anger of someone who'd spent his career protecting families from exactly this type of betrayal. He immediately called for backup, while informing Vincent that he was now dealing with a family that had been cooperating with law enforcement for months to document drug trafficking activities. Vincent's reaction was swift and telling. He accused my parents of playing both sides, claiming they'd been feeding information to multiple organizations while pretending to be loyal to his business interests. He suggested that Marcus's death might not have been accidental if he'd discovered his parents' multiple betrayals. Patricia broke down, completely admitting that they'd been terrified of Vincent but couldn't stop taking his money because they'd become financially dependent on the extra income. She claimed they'd never intended for anyone to get hurt. They just wanted to protect themselves while earning enough money to maintain their retirement lifestyle. Robert's confession was even more damaging. He revealed that they'd been warned Marcus was becoming a liability to Vincent's organization, and they'd been specifically instructed to provide information that would help resolve the situation permanently. They'd known their cooperation was contributing to escalating pressure that might result in violence against their own son. The children listened to their grandparents' admissions with expressions of horror that no child should ever experience. Emma's face showed the particular pain of someone who was old enough to understand that the adults who should have protected her family had actually helped destroy it. Jake and Lucy clung to each other, unable to comprehend the scope of betrayal they were witnessing. Sarah had been quietly recording everything on her phone, understanding that this evidence would be crucial for the children's future safety and legal protection. Her experience with family law cases had taught her to document situations that involved criminal activity and child endangerment, especially when the evidence might be needed to prevent future victimization. The situation exploded when Vincent realized that my parents' cooperation with law enforcement meant his entire operation was compromised. He accused them of wearing recording devices and threatened to resolve the problem permanently before leaving the apartment. His associates moved toward their weapons, transforming a tense confrontation into a potentially deadly encounter. That's when my military training from my college ROTC program kicked in. I positioned myself between the armed men and the children, using furniture to create barriers while quietly activating the building's emergency alarm system through my phone app. The fire alarm's deafening noise would bring first responders and make it impossible for Vincent to control the situation. Officer Williams drew his weapon while calling for immediate backup, explaining that he was dealing with armed drug dealers who were threatening multiple civilians, including 3 minor children. His radio crackled with responses from units that were already en route, having been dispatched when he'd first requested assistance 20 minutes earlier. Emma demonstrated courage that amazed everyone in the room. She stood up and addressed Vincent, directly explaining that her father had never trusted anyone enough to share real information about his business activities. She told him that Marcus had been convinced his parents were stealing from him and had specifically avoided keeping anything valuable where they might find it. Her testimony was devastating to Vincent's remaining hopes of recovering the stolen money. She described Marcus's final weeks when he'd become increasingly paranoid about everyone in his life, including his children. He'd moved them frequently and kept them isolated specifically because he believed people were trying to use them to get information about his activities. Jake surprised everyone by speaking up to support his sister's account. He remembered their dad hiding things in places where grandparents couldn't reach them, like under bridges and inside abandoned buildings. Marcus had specifically told them never to tell anyone where he went during his mysterious trips because old people couldn't be trusted with important secrets. Lucy's contribution was the most damaging to my parents' credibility with Vincent. She revealed that Marcus had often talked about how much he hated taking money from people who asked too many questions about his business. He'd complained that some people wanted to control his choices in exchange for helping him, and he'd planned to find ways to work independently. The SWAT team's arrival ended the standoff before anyone could act on their threats. Vincent and his associates were arrested on charges ranging from drug trafficking to attempted extortion and child endangerment. Officer Williams ensured that my parents were also taken into custody for their role in facilitating the criminal enterprise that had ultimately led to their son's death. But the most shocking revelation came from the detective who interviewed Emma separately from the other children. She admitted that she'd known about her grandparents' cooperation with the dangerous men who frightened her father. Marcus had discovered evidence of their betrayal weeks before his death and had been planning to expose them to law enforcement when the car accident occurred. Emma had been carrying the burden of knowing that her own grandparents had contributed to the circumstances that made her father's life dangerous and unstable. She'd understood that Patricia and Robert cared more about money than family safety, but she'd been too young and powerless to protect anyone from the consequences of their choices. The detective's report would later reveal that Marcus's car accident might not have been accidental. Evidence suggested he'd been fleeing from someone when he lost control of his vehicle, and witness accounts described another car leaving the scene immediately after the crash. My parents' cooperation with Vincent had provided the information necessary to track Marcus's movements on the night he died. As the apartments cleared of law enforcement and arrested criminals, I was left with 3 traumatized children who'd just learned that their grandparents had been complicit in their father's death. The custody arrangement that had seemed like manipulation now looked like divine intervention, removing them from dangerous people who'd prioritized money over family welfare. Sarah held Lucy while Jake pressed against my side, seeking comfort from adults who'd actually protected them when threats became real. Emma sat quietly processing everything she'd witnessed, probably wondering if there were any adults in her life who could be trusted to prioritize her welfare over their own interests. The immediate danger was over, but the emotional healing would take much longer. These children had just learned that betrayal could come from the people who should love them most, and that survival sometimes required courage beyond their years. They'd also learned that some adults were worth trusting, even when trusting felt impossible after experiencing so much disappointment. The legal aftermath of that terrifying evening unfolded over the following weeks, like a masterclass in how justice can sometimes prevail when enough evidence accumulates to make denial impossible. My parents' arrest had triggered investigations into multiple criminal activities, revealing a web of corruption and betrayal that extended far beyond what any of us had initially imagined. District Attorney Maria Santos personally took charge of the prosecution, recognizing that this case involved not just drug trafficking and extortion, but also elderly perpetrators who'd systematically endangered their own grandchildren for financial gain. Her office viewed the case as an opportunity to send a strong message about accountability for people who facilitated criminal enterprises while hiding behind respectable facades. Patricia and Robert were charged with conspiracy to distribute controlled substances accessory to extortion, child endangerment, and fraud related to the Social Security benefits they'd been collecting for the children while providing no actual care. The evidence against them was overwhelming, including recorded conversations, financial records, and testimony from multiple witnesses who'd observed their cooperation with Vincent's organization. The children's safety became the court's primary concern, with Judge Catherine Morrison appointing a guardian ad litem to ensure their interests were protected throughout the legal proceedings. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a child psychologist specializing in trauma recovery, was assigned to evaluate their emotional needs and recommend appropriate therapeutic interventions. Emma, Jake, and Lucy were remarkably resilient during their interviews with law enforcement and court officials. Emma's testimony was particularly powerful as she described years of instability and fear while living with Marcus, followed by the shocking discovery that their grandparents had been contributing to their father's dangerous lifestyle rather than protecting their grandchildren from its consequences. The twins' accounts were heartbreaking in their simplicity. They remembered being hungry, scared, and confused during their final months with Marcus, but they also remembered their grandparents promising help that never materialized. Jake specifically recalled overhearing phone conversations between Patricia and strangers who seemed to know details about their family life that should have been private. Sarah's legal expertise proved invaluable as we navigated the complex custody proceedings that would determine the children's permanent placement. She helped me understand my rights as their current guardian and the steps necessary to formalize adoption proceedings that would provide long-term stability for kids who'd already experienced too much uncertainty. Dr. Walsh's psychological evaluation revealed that despite their traumatic experiences, all three children were functioning remarkably well and had formed strong attachments to both Sarah and me. Her report recommended permanent placement in our home, citing the children's obvious comfort with our family structure and their expressed desire to remain with adults who'd proven their commitment to protecting rather than exploiting them. The investigation into Marcus's death revealed evidence that supported Emma's worst fears about her father's final weeks. Detective Raymond Clark discovered that Vincent's organization had been pressuring Marcus to increase his drug distribution activities, while my parents provided information that made it impossible for him to avoid their demands. Marcus had apparently been planning to relocate his children and disappear from Austin when the car accident occurred. His apartment contained packed suitcases and research about cities in other states where they might start fresh. Phone records showed he'd been making inquiries about witness protection programs and ways to safely extract his family from dangerous situations. The financial investigation revealed the true scope of my parents' greed and selfishness. Over 2 years, they'd received over $36,000 from Vincent's organization, while simultaneously collecting Social Security survivor benefits intended for their grandchildren's care. They'd used the money to fund luxury purchases and travel while the children lived in poverty and fear. Most damaging was the discovery of Patricia's detailed journals documenting her communications with Vincent and her observations about Marcus's activities. Her own handwriting revealed someone who was fully aware of the risks she was creating for her family, while justifying her choices as necessary for her own financial security and safety. The journals also revealed my parents' awareness of Marcus's deteriorating mental health and increasing desperation during his final months. Rather than intervening to help him or protect his children, they'd continued providing information to his tormentors while expressing annoyance about his inability to manage his criminal activities more efficiently. Vincent's plea agreement included testimony about my parents' enthusiastic cooperation with his organization's efforts to monitor and control Marcus's behavior. He described Patricia as particularly eager to provide detailed information about her son's movements and emotional state, often volunteering observations that helped his organization manipulate Marcus more effectively. The sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for the children to address the court about how their grandparents' choices had affected their lives. Emma's victim impact statement was devastating in its quiet dignity, describing years of fear and instability that might have been prevented if Patricia and Robert had chosen to protect rather than exploit their family. She explained how confusing it had been to love grandparents who seemed caring during brief visits but never provided meaningful help during crises. She described the cognitive dissonance of children who couldn't understand why adults with comfortable homes and stable finances would watch their grandchildren struggle with hunger and homelessness. Jake and Lucy's statements were shorter, but equally powerful, focusing on their memories of being afraid and hungry while knowing their grandparents had nice food and safe beds they weren't allowed to share. Lucy's comment that she'd thought grandparents were supposed to protect grandchildren rather than help bad people hurt their families brought tears to everyone in the courtroom. Judge Morrison's sentencing reflected her disgust with my parents' choices and her determination to ensure they faced meaningful consequences for endangering children. Patricia received 4 years in state prison, while Robert received 3.5 years, with both sentences including requirements for restitution payments to cover the children's therapy and educational expenses. The financial judgment was particularly satisfying. My parents were ordered to liquidate their rental properties and use the proceeds to establish educational trust funds for all 3 children. Their retirement savings were also partially seized to cover therapy costs and compensation for the emotional damage they'd inflicted through their betrayal and neglect. But the most meaningful outcome was the court's formal recognition of my permanent guardianship and Sarah's status as the children's legal stepmother following our marriage 3 months later. The adoption proceedings were expedited based on the children's clearly expressed wishes and the overwhelming evidence of our commitment to their welfare. Emma, Jake, and Lucy legally became our children on a sunny Tuesday morning in Judge Morrison's courtroom, surrounded by friends who'd become our chosen family and teachers who'd witnessed their transformation from traumatized survivors to thriving kids with bright futures ahead of them. The ceremony was simple but profound, with each child choosing to keep their original first names while taking our last name to symbolize their new beginning. Emma spoke for all 3 when she told the judge that they finally felt safe enough to hope for good things in their futures, something that hadn't been possible during the years of uncertainty and fear. Dr. Walsh's final report documented remarkable progress in all 3 children's emotional healing and academic performance. Emma's grades had improved dramatically, while Jake and Lucy had developed friendships and confidence that reflected their newfound sense of security and stability in a home where their welfare was the primary concern. The trust funds established with my parents' seized assets would ensure all 3 children could attend college without financial stress, transforming their betrayal into opportunities for education and advancement. Sometimes, justice involves turning the resources used for harm into tools for healing and growth. As we left the courthouse that day, legally recognized as a family that had been forged through crisis, but strengthened through love and commitment, I reflected on how my parents' abandonment during my cancer battle had actually prepared me to provide the protection and stability these children desperately needed when they had nowhere else to turn. 6 months later, as I watched Emma help Jake and Lucy with their homework at our new kitchen table in the house we'd purchased with room for everyone to grow, I realized that sometimes the most profound transformations emerge from the ashes of betrayal and abandonment. The children who'd arrived at my apartment as traumatized survivors had become confident kids who believed in their own futures and trusted the adults who'd committed to protecting them. Emma had blossomed into the brilliant student she'd always had the potential to be when she wasn't carrying the burden of adult responsibilities that should never have fallen to a 12-year-old child. Her teachers marveled at her academic progress and her emergence as a natural leader who helped other students navigate difficult situations with wisdom beyond her years. Jake had discovered a passion for building things, spending hours constructing elaborate structures with blocks and art supplies that reflected his growing sense of security and creativity. His nightmares about scary men and hungry nights had gradually faded, replaced by dreams about becoming an architect who could design safe homes for families who needed protection. Lucy had developed into a social butterfly who made friends easily and trusted adults appropriately, demonstrating remarkable resilience for someone who'd experienced so much instability during her early childhood. Her laughter filled our house with joy that reminded us daily why fighting for these children had been the most important battle any of us had ever won. Sarah had embraced her role as their mother with natural grace and fierce protectiveness, using her legal expertise to ensure their interests were protected while providing the nurturing care they'd never received from the adults who should have loved them unconditionally. Her transformation from supportive girlfriend to devoted mother had been seamless and beautiful to witness. The house we'd bought reflected our commitment to building something permanent and secure for our family. Each child had their own bedroom decorated according to their personal interests, with Emma's walls covered in science posters and maps of colleges she might attend. Jake's room filled with building supplies and architectural books, and Lucy's space decorated with artwork and photos of the friends who'd become her chosen sisters. Our kitchen had become the heart of our home, where homework was completed, family meetings were held, and memories were created through shared meals and conversations about dreams that were finally safe to pursue. The children had learned that adults could be trusted to keep their promises and prioritize their welfare over personal convenience or financial considerations. The trust funds established from my parents' seized assets had grown substantially under careful management, ensuring that all three children would have educational opportunities their biological parents could never have provided. Emma had already begun researching universities with strong science programs, while Jake and Lucy knew they could pursue whatever careers captured their interests without worrying about financial limitations. Dr. Walsh's continued therapy sessions had helped all of us process the trauma and betrayal that had brought us together, while building healthy communication patterns that would serve our family for years to come. Her guidance had been especially valuable in helping the children understand that their parents' failures reflected adult choices rather than any deficiency in their worth or lovability. The criminal justice system had followed through on its promises of accountability for the adults who'd prioritized their own interests over child welfare. Vincent and his associates were serving lengthy federal sentences for drug trafficking and organized criminal activity, while my parents remained in state prison with limited prospects for early release. Patricia had written several letters attempting to justify her choices and request forgiveness, but the children had unanimously decided they weren't ready for contact with someone who'd proven willing to endanger them for money. Emma had wisely observed that people who'd betrayed their family's trust would need to demonstrate genuine change before any relationship could be considered. Robert's letters had been fewer and more focused on self-pity than accountability, reinforcing our decision to maintain distance until he could acknowledge the harm his choices had caused rather than seeking sympathy for the consequences he was experiencing. The children deserved protection from adults who remained more concerned with their own comfort than their victims' healing. The investigation had also revealed additional assets my parents had hidden, including a $50,000 inheritance from my grandmother that should have been used for my medical expenses during my cancer treatment. The recovered funds had been added to the children's education accounts, transforming another layer of betrayal into opportunities for their advancement. My own healing had been profound and unexpected. Learning to trust my instincts about people's motivations had helped me recognize that my parents' abandonment during my illness had actually been a gift that freed me from toxic relationships and prepared me to build something healthier with people who shared my values about family loyalty and mutual support. Sarah and I had married in a small ceremony at the children's school, surrounded by teachers and friends who'd witnessed our family's transformation from crisis to stability. Emma, Jake, and Lucy had served as our wedding party, officially welcoming Sarah as their mother and celebrating the legal recognition of bonds that had already been forged through love and commitment. The children's biological father's grave had become a place they visited occasionally to process their complex feelings about someone who'd loved them but failed to protect them from the consequences of his choices. Their conversations with Dr. Walsh had helped them understand that grief could coexist with relief and that missing someone didn't require excusing the harm their actions had caused. Marcus's friends who'd managed to overcome their own addiction problems had reached out to share positive memories of their father during his healthier periods, helping the children develop a more complete understanding of the man he'd been before drugs destroyed his judgment and priorities. These connections had provided healing closure without romanticizing the destructive choices that had ultimately led to his death. Our extended family now included Kevin, who'd supported me through cancer treatment, Diana, who'd helped expose the truth about my parents' betrayal, and Thomas, who'd provided legal guidance that protected our family's interests throughout the complex proceedings. These chosen family members had demonstrated that loyalty and love were actions rather than accidents of birth. The children had also formed connections with other families who'd been created through adoption and foster care, learning that many of the strongest families were built through choice rather than biology. These relationships had reinforced their understanding that they weren't defined by their original circumstances, but by the opportunities they chose to pursue with the support of adults who genuinely cared about their welfare. Community involvement had become an important part of our family identity, with all of us volunteering at organizations that supported children in foster care and families affected by addiction. The children's experiences had given them unique perspectives that helped other kids navigate similar challenges while reinforcing their own healing and growth. Emma had started a support group at her school for students dealing with family trauma, using her experiences to help classmates understand that survival was possible and that asking for help was a sign of strength rather than weakness. Her leadership had impressed administrators and teachers who recognized her potential for future careers in social work or counseling. Jake and Lucy had participated in fundraising activities for organizations that provided emergency housing for families displaced by domestic violence or addiction, understanding from personal experience how quickly children could lose their homes through no fault of their own. Their empathy and generosity had touched everyone who witnessed their transformation from victims to advocates. As I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point of peace and possibility, I understood that my parents' cruelest betrayals had inadvertently prepared me to recognize what real family relationships should look like. Their abandonment had taught me to value people who showed up during crises and to distrust those who offered excuses rather than support when challenges arose. The children who'd been forced into my life through manipulation and deception had become the greatest blessing I'd ever received, teaching me that love was a choice that required daily commitment rather than an emotion that could be assumed based on shared genetics. Their resilience had inspired my own healing, while their trust had motivated me to become worthy of their faith in my ability to protect them. Sarah's presence in our lives had demonstrated that partnership meant choosing to face challenges together rather than using difficulties as excuses to avoid responsibility. Her willingness to embrace 3 children who weren't biologically hers had shown all of us what unconditional love looked like when it was backed by consistent action and genuine commitment. The legal and financial resolution of my parents' crimes had provided closure and resources, but the real healing had come through building new traditions and memories that replaced fear with hope and uncertainty with stability. Our family had been forged through crisis, but strengthened through choosing each other every day since that first terrifying evening when 3 scared children had shown up at my door. Looking ahead, I could see bright futures for kids who'd once believed they were destined for struggle and disappointment. Emma's dreams of becoming a scientist were supported by excellent grades and teachers who believed in her potential. Jake's fascination with architecture was encouraged through programs that nurtured his creativity and spatial intelligence. Lucy's social gifts were celebrated and developed through activities that built confidence and leadership skills. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals become the foundation for the most meaningful victories. My parents' abandonment during my cancer battle had prepared me to provide the stability these children needed when they had nowhere else to turn. Their willingness to sacrifice their grandchildren's welfare for personal gain had removed dangerous influences from kids who deserved protection and care from adults who prioritized their well-being above all other considerations. The wake-up call I'd given my parents had cost them their freedom, their assets, and their relationship with their grandchildren, but it had also prevented them from causing additional harm to vulnerable people who couldn't protect themselves. Sometimes justice requires that people face the full consequences of their choices, especially when those choices endanger children who depend on adults to make decisions that prioritize their safety and welfare. As we planned our first family vacation to visit colleges, Emma might want to attend celebrated Jake's acceptance into an advanced building and design program and watch Lucy perform in her school's talent show. I realized that we'd built something beautiful from the ruins of betrayal and abandonment. Our family had been tested by fire and emerged stronger, closer, and more grateful for the love we'd chosen to share with each other. The children who'd once been pawns in dangerous games were now confident kids who knew their worth and believed in their ability to create positive futures. The man who'd once been abandoned by his parents during his darkest hour had become someone who could provide the protection and stability that vulnerable children desperately needed. Love had triumphed over betrayal. Choice had proven stronger than biology, and justice had ultimately prevailed for kids who deserved better than the adults who'd failed them. Our story had begun with manipulation and fear, but it had evolved into something beautiful that would continue growing for years to come. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between family loyalty and protecting innocent people who couldn't defend themselves? What would you have done if you discovered the people you trusted had been working against your family's safety and welfare? I'd love to hear your thoughts about how families can overcome betrayal and build stronger relationships based on genuine care rather than obligation. Thank you for joining me on this journey from abandonment to redemption. I hope our story reminds you that sometimes the greatest challenges in life prepare us for the most important victories, and that real families are built through love and commitment rather than shared genetics. Please like this video if it touched your heart, subscribe to hear more stories about overcoming adversity, share it with someone who might need inspiration about family healing, and comment below with your own experiences about building chosen families that provide the love and support everyone deserves. Remember that healing is possible, justice can prevail, and love has the power to transform even the most broken situations into something beautiful when people choose to prioritize each other's welfare over their own convenience. Until next time, may you find the strength to protect those who need your care and the wisdom to recognize the difference between people who deserve your trust and those who've proven they don't.